The wind didn't just whistle through that train station. It groaned, like the whole frozen country knew another soul had just arrived with nowhere to go. Nora Vance stepped off the last car, her boots hitting the wooden platform with a sound that was too loud, too final. In one hand, she held the worn leather handle of a trunk. In the other, hidden deep in her coat pocket, was the letter. She knew the words by heart. Plain words from a plain man. Royce Mercer, widower, 59. He was looking for a steady woman, he wrote, someone to build a life with. And like a fool, Nora had believed every single word. She'd packed her whole life into that trunk, sold the rest, and traveled 1,000 miles on the promise of those words. But as she stood on that platform, the promise was already starting to feel thin, like ice over deep water. The platform was nearly empty. A couple of kids were skipping rocks down the iron rails. The station clerk didn't even look up from his papers. And then she saw him. He stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates, his coat too clean for this part of the country, his mustache trimmed just so. He walked toward her, slow, his eyes taking her in like she was a piece of livestock he wasn't sure he wanted to bid on. "Miss Vance?" he asked, his voice softer than she'd imagined. "Yes," she said, her own voice steady, refusing to tremble in the cold. He didn't move any closer. His gaze lingered on her face, then dropped to her hands, then to the heavy trunk at her feet. A long, uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Then he finally spoke the words that would change everything. "I thought you'd be younger." Nora didn't answer right away. She just let his words hang there in the freezing air, ugly and exposed. "I'm 58, she said finally, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "And I got here on time." Royce Mercer had the decency to look away, but the damage was done. He stammered something about wanting a family, about raising children, how he should have been clearer in his letter. "You were clear enough," Nora cut him off. "You just didn't write down the part you were ashamed to say." He had no reply for that. His jaw tightened. "I'm sorry," he said, the words clipped and final. "This won't work." And just like that, he turned his back on her. He walked away without another word, without offering a ride into town, without even a glance back. The train let out a mournful groan behind her and began to pull away, leaving her utterly alone. The wind howled, and for the first time, Nora felt a kind of cold that had nothing to do with the snow. The station clerk, seeing the whole pathetic exchange, finally showed a flicker of interest. He slid open his little window. "Next train heading east ain't till Thursday," he said, not unkindly. "You can leave that trunk inside. No one will touch it." Nora looked down at the trunk, the sum total of her life. She could leave it. She could wait for the Thursday train. She could go back to the life she'd so eagerly left behind. But then she bent down, her gloved fingers wrapping tight around the handle. "I'll carry it," she said. And she did. She walked off that platform not like a woman who'd been left behind, but like a woman who was just getting started. The town watched her walk. Every pair of eyes from the general store to the saloon followed her progress. She was a spectacle. A woman of a certain age, alone, hauling a heavy trunk down the middle of the main street like she had somewhere to be. She didn't. She just knew she couldn't stay still. To stop moving was to let the cold win. Her hands were numb, her arms ached, but she kept going, one thud of the trunk after another. It was then that a voice cut through the silence. "You look like you're dragging more than you packed." She turned. Leaning against a post outside the livery was a man. He was tall, weathered, his coat patched at the shoulder. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes weren't cold either. "That depends," Nora said, sizing him up. "You offering help or judgment?" The man pushed himself off the post and walked toward her. "Help don't come with strings," he said. Judgments for men who don't hold doors. He looked from her to the trunk, then back to her face. Name's Gideon Blake. He didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. The whole town already knew who she was. He just pointed with his chin toward the back of the livery. Wagon's tied up. I can give you a place to set that down. The ride out of town was quiet. The kind of quiet that listens more than it talks. Gideon Blake didn't ask where she was going, because he knew she had nowhere to go. He just drove the wagon steady, away from the prying eyes of the town, toward the thick woods that bordered his land. The cabin was small, built low to the ground, with a steady plume of smoke rising from the stone chimney. It looked solid, permanent. Inside it was warm and smelled of coffee and pine. Gideon carried her trunk in without a word and set it by the fire. "Chair's yours," he said. "Stove's hot. I don't ask questions after dark." "You live alone?" she asked, pulling off her gloves. "Long enough to know it don't mean empty," he replied. They sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling between them. Two strangers in a one-room cabin, surrounded by a world of snow and secrets. Nora felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease for the first time since she'd stepped off that train. It was a fragile peace, but it was peace nonetheless. But as the night deepened and the wind began to howl again, a sharp knock echoed through the small cabin. 3 quick raps, too clean, too precise for a traveler lost in a storm. Gideon was on his feet in an instant, the rifle that had been leaning by the door now in his hands like it was an extension of his arm. He cracked the door, the rifle held low and ready. Standing on the porch was a man, his coat soaked through, his smile a little too bright. "Name's Jed Carver," he said. "Horse snapped a leg a few miles back. Wondering if you folks had a floor I could borrow for the night." Gideon didn't move. He just stared at the man, his eyes narrowed. "You armed?" Jed Carver's smile widened. "Only with charm," he said. Gideon didn't smile back. He just stepped aside. "Blankets by the fire. The floor is yours. You keep your hands to yourself." Jed stepped inside, his eyes immediately sweeping the room, taking in Nora, the table, and finally, her trunk. "Cozy," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Didn't figure you for a couple." Nora looked up from her chair, her gaze level. "That's because you assume too much." Jed just chuckled and settled himself by the fire, stretching his legs out. He was too close to her trunk, way too close. He yawned, a theatrical over-the-top affair. "Storm'll trap us all in," he said. "No use worrying tonight." "I ain't worried," Gideon said from the shadows, his voice low. Jed muttered something under his breath and rolled over, facing the fire. A few minutes later, the sound of his steady, even breathing filled the cabin. But something was wrong. It was too even, too perfect. Nora watched him for a long time, her own breathing shallow. She caught Gideon's eye across the room. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He knew it too. Leaning forward, Nora whispered so low it was barely a breath. "He's not asleep." "I know," Gideon whispered back. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every crackle of the fire sounded like a gunshot. Nora's heart was pounding against her ribs. She'd seen this kind of act before, the man who pretends to be helpless, who waits for you to lower your guard. Gideon hadn't moved from his spot by the door, the rifle still held loosely in his hands. It was clear he'd seen it too. "You want to tell it?" she whispered, her eyes never leaving the man on the floor. Gideon stared into the fire, his face a mask of old memories. "My brother," he began, his voice barely audible over the wind. "He brought a man home after the war, said the fella saved his life. Turned out the man would rather take a life than earn his keep." "What happened?" Nora pressed. Gideon's jaw tightened. "Let's just say I woke up first." The words hung in the air between them, a grim promise. Nora gave a single, sharp nod. They were two people who understood that survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the first to see the danger coming. Outside, the storm raged, throwing itself against the small cabin. But inside, it had met something it couldn't move, something it couldn't break. The night wore on, an eternity of silence and suspicion. By morning, the wind had died down, but the silence inside the cabin was heavier than any storm. Jed Carver hadn't moved a muscle all night. Not a twitch, not a single sigh. It was the most unnatural sleep Nora had ever seen. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, he suddenly sat up, a wide grin plastered on his face as if nothing was wrong. "That's some fire," he said cheerfully. "You folks sure know how to keep a guest from freezing." Gideon just stirred the embers in the stove, his back to the room. But Nora knew he was watching. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight. "You always offer up shelter to strangers?" Jed asked, his eyes fixing on Nora. "Only when the storm's meaner than the man," Gideon replied without turning around. Jed's gaze lingered on Nora, a slow, calculating look. "Ain't many women like you this far out." Nora didn't even blink. "Good. Then you won't have anyone to compare me to when I throw you out." Jed's cheerful mask finally dropped. He laughed, a low, sharp sound that held no humor. And then he moved. He lunged for the rifle Gideon had set down by the door, but Gideon was faster. He slammed his shoulder into Jed, sending the man crashing against the log wall. Jed came up spitting, a wicked-looking knife appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. He was halfway across the room before he realized his mistake. Nora was already on her feet. In her hand was a small, pearl-handled revolver. She hadn't even thought about it. Her hand had just gone to the flour tin on the mantelpiece, where the gun had been hiding for years. "Drop it," she said, her voice calm and deadly. Jed froze, his eyes darting from the gun to her face. "You're bluffing," he sneered. "Try me." His gaze flickered to Gideon, who hadn't moved, then back to Nora. He saw something in her eyes that made him hesitate. "You ain't gonna shoot me," he said, but the confidence was gone from his voice. "I've buried worse," she said flatly, "and I'm not in a forgiving mood today." For a long second, nobody moved. Then, with a clatter, the knife fell from Jed's hand onto the floorboards. "You're both crazy," he spat. "No," Gideon said, finally moving to stand beside Nora. "We just keep what's ours." "Get out," Nora said, the revolver still steady in her hand. Jed backed toward the door, his hands raised. He slammed it shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden quiet of the cabin. Nora slowly lowered the gun and placed it back in the flour tin. The room settled. The danger was gone, but the questions remained. Who was Jed Carver, and what did he really want? Because it was obvious now. He wasn't just some drifter. He had come for something, and his eyes had kept flicking to one thing and one thing only: her trunk. The air in the cabin had changed. The immediate threat was gone, but a new unspoken tension had taken its place. Gideon didn't ask about the revolver. He didn't have to. The way she'd handled it told him everything he needed to know. "You've done that before," he stated, not as a question. "Enough times to know you don't wait for someone else to pull the trigger," she replied, her voice still tight. They spent the rest of the day in a shared, focused silence. They worked outside, mending a section of fence that had been brought down by the snow. The physical labor was a relief, a way to work through the adrenaline and the fear. "Fence post is crooked," Nora observed, pulling the wire taut. "So's the ground," Gideon said, not looking up from his work. "You fix one, the other just leans harder. Still worth setting it right, though." That night, when Nora came inside, she found that Gideon had moved a second chair next to hers by the fire. He'd nudged her trunk aside to make room for it. Neither of them said a word about it, but when she sat down, it felt like a silent agreement had been made. Later, as the fire burned low, Gideon poured her a second cup of coffee. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "There's a town dance next Saturday." Nora raised an eyebrow. "You dance?" "Poorly," he admitted, "but not alone if I can help it." She took a slow sip of her coffee, thinking. "You asking me to get stared at? In a room full of people who've already decided who I am?" "No," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm asking if you'll stand beside me while they try to figure out why I'm smiling more than usual." She set her cup down. A dozen reasons to say no flashed through her mind. It was too soon. It would cause talk. It would draw the wrong kind of attention. But then she thought of Royce Mercer's sneer, of Jed Carver's predatory eyes, of the whispers that had followed her down the main street. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of being invisible. "You sure?" she asked him. "I've been sure of less and asked for more," he said simply. She didn't give him an answer right away, but she didn't say no. And in the quiet of that cabin, surrounded by the vast, unforgiving wilderness, that was more than enough. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with a new possibility, a fragile hope that was more terrifying and more thrilling than any threat that lurked in the darkness outside. Because they both knew this wasn't just about a dance. It was about drawing a line in the snow. When Saturday came, the sky was clear and painfully bright. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath. Nora stepped down from Gideon's wagon wearing her best dress, a simple dark blue wool that she hadn't worn in years. Her hair was pinned up, and she wore a small silver brooch, the only piece of real jewelry she owned. Gideon offered his arm, and she took it. As they walked into the town hall, the fiddle music faltered for a beat. Every head turned. The whispers started instantly, a rustling sound that spread through the room like fire in dry grass. They saw the woman who had been rejected on the train platform, the woman who had no business being here. But she wasn't alone anymore. Gideon led her straight to the center of the floor as the music started up again. "Still sure?" he whispered, his hand firm on her back. "I don't do things halfway, Gideon Blake," she said, lifting her chin. Their steps weren't perfect, but they moved together, a small island of defiance in a sea of judgment. They didn't owe this town anything. They didn't need their approval. They just needed to not be alone. Across the room, a woman sniffed loudly to her friend. "She's far too old for that sort of thing." Nora heard her. She didn't falter. She just leaned closer to Gideon. "Good," she murmured. "Means I'm dancing for me, not for them." He smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes. "You always were." But then Nora's blood ran cold. Standing in the far corner, half hidden in the shadows by the door, was Royce Mercer. He wasn't watching the dancers, he was watching her. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that stunned her. He had rejected her, humiliated her. Why did he care who she danced with? It didn't make sense. Unless it wasn't about her at all. Unless her being with Gideon was a problem for him. A big one. Gideon saw the direction of her gaze, and his whole body went rigid. His hand, which had been resting on her waist, dropped instinctively to his side, his fingers flexing as if reaching for a gun that wasn't there. The music swirled around them, but for Nora and Gideon, the dance was over. A new, more dangerous one had just begun. The ride back to the cabin was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. The festive air of the dance was gone, replaced by the chilling image of Royce Mercer's face in the shadows. Once inside, with the door bolted and the fire stoked, the questions they'd been avoiding finally surfaced. "You know him," Nora said. It wasn't a question. Gideon stared into the flames, his profile carved out of granite. "I know him." He took a deep breath. "His first wife. Her name was Elspeth. We were to be married." The words came out rough, torn from a place deep inside him. "Royce came to town with money and promises. He swept her off her feet. A year later, she was dead. A riding accident, they called it, thrown from her horse. He turned to look at Nora, his eyes burning with an old, cold rage. Elspeth could ride before she could walk. She wouldn't have been thrown from her horse. A terrible understanding began to dawn on Nora. This wasn't just a simple story of rejection. This was something much older, much darker. "You think he killed her," she whispered. "I know he did," Gideon said, his voice flat. "But I could never prove it. The sheriff was his man. The whole town was afraid of him. He owns nearly everything and everyone." He paused, his gaze falling on the letter Nora had received, which she'd left on the mantelpiece. "Let me see that." He picked it up, his rough fingers tracing the elegant handwriting. He read it once, then twice. This is his writing, but it feels wrong. Nora took the letter from him, her own mind racing. She remembered Royce's strange reaction at the station, his fury at the dance. It was all connected. She held the letter up to the lamplight, scrutinizing it in a way she never had before. And then she saw it, something she had overlooked 100 times. A faint impression on the paper, almost invisible unless you held it at just the right angle. A watermark. It was a circle with 2 crossed pickaxes in the center. The seal of the Black Creek Mining Company. Black Creek Mining? Gideon breathed, leaning closer. That company went bust 20 years ago. The mines dried up. Everyone who worked there lost everything and left. But Nora's heart was pounding. A forgotten memory was surfacing. The woman who had given her Royce Mercer's name, her dying friend Martha back east. Martha had often spoken of her younger brother, a geologist who had worked for a mining company out west before he vanished without a trace. Martha had never said the name of the company. She had only said that her brother had uncovered a terrible secret, a secret that had cost him his life. And just before she died, Martha had given Nora the trunk. "It's just old linens," she had said, "but you keep it close, Nora. Promise me." Nora looked from the letter to the heavy trunk sitting by the hearth. It had been a silent witness to everything. It wasn't just a collection of her belongings, it was a secret. And whatever was inside it, Royce Mercer wanted it back. Desperately. Without a word, they moved to the trunk. Gideon pried open the lid. Inside lay the neatly folded linens and clothes, the smell of lavender rising from them. It looked perfectly normal. "Martha told me to keep it close," Nora murmured, her hands trembling as she began to pull everything out. They emptied the trunk, piece by piece, until it was bare. Nothing. Just the dark, aged wood of the interior. Nora ran her hands along the bottom, feeling for any loose boards, any hidden compartments. Her fingers snagged on the edge of the fabric lining. It was tacked down tight. "The knife," she said to Gideon. He brought it to her, and she carefully began to slit the worn velvet lining away from the wood. It peeled back with a dry, ripping sound. And underneath was another bottom. A false bottom. Gideon took the knife and carefully worked the edges of the thin wooden plank. It lifted away with a groan. And there, nestled in the dark space beneath, was a heavy, leather-bound book. A ledger. And tucked inside its pages was a single folded letter. Nora's hands shook as she picked up the letter. The paper was brittle with age. The handwriting was frantic, spidery. "If you are reading this," it began, "then I am already dead, and my sister Martha has done as I asked." It was from Martha's brother. He wrote that Royce Mercer hadn't found a defunct mine at Black Creek. He'd found one of the richest silver veins in the territory. But instead of announcing it, he'd cooked up a scheme. The ledger was the proof. Page after page detailed a pattern of pure evil. Mercer would target a struggling rancher whose land bordered the mine. He would use his dummy corporation to buy up their debt, and then, inevitably, an accident would happen. A fire, a rock slide, a stray gunshot during hunting season. With the rancher dead, Mercer would foreclose on the property for pennies on the dollar, all while secretly knowing the land was worth a fortune. The most damning entry was the last one. It was for a parcel of land registered to Elspeth Mercer, her own land, inherited from her father. According to the notes, Elspeth had discovered the ledger. She had confronted Royce, threatening to expose him. The very next day, she died in her riding accident. Martha's brother had found the ledger in Royce's study and, terrified, had fled, sending the book to his sister for safekeeping just before he disappeared forever. Royce Mercer hadn't just murdered Gideon's love. He had built an empire on a foundation of graves. Nora finally understood. Mercer hadn't been looking for a wife. He'd been looking for the trunk. He must have learned through his contacts back east that Martha had died and left her belongings to Nora. So he sent the letter, a honey trap to lure her and the trunk west. He never imagined she would be a woman of 58. His plan was to charm a young, naive bride, marry her, and take possession of the trunk and its secret. But Nora's age had thrown a wrench in his plans. His public rejection of her at the station wasn't personal. It was strategic. He wanted to isolate her, make her vulnerable. He had sent Jed Carver not just to steal the trunk, but to retrieve the evidence that could destroy him. Suddenly, the howl of the wind outside was joined by another sound, the crunch of many boots on snow, the nicker of a horse. Gideon moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. "It's him," he said, his voice grim. "He's got Jed with him, and 3 other men. They're surrounding the cabin." A voice cut through the night, dripping with arrogance and rage. It was Royce Mercer. "Blake, I know you're in there. Send the woman out with the trunk, and I'll let you live." The small cabin, once a shelter, had just become a fortress, and they were under siege. "He's not getting this book," Nora said, her voice shaking but filled with a steely resolve. She looked at the revolver she had placed back in the flour tin. Then she looked at Gideon. He was no longer just the quiet man who had offered her a ride. He was the man whose life had been stolen by the monster outside, and she was no longer the woman who had arrived with nothing. She had arrived with justice, packed away in the false bottom of a trunk. "He called me old," she said, a grim smile touching her lips. "He has no idea what old can do." Gideon grabbed his rifle. "He's not getting through that door." The first shot shattered the night, splintering the wood of the cabin door. The siege had begun. Mercer's voice boomed again from the darkness. "This is your last chance, Blake! The trunk for your lives!" Gideon didn't answer. He just moved to the far wall, pressing his back against the logs, his rifle aimed at the door. Nora grabbed the revolver and took a position by the window, peering into the moonlit snow. She could see them now, 5 dark figures spreading out, using the trees for cover. They were treating this like a military operation. "They're going to try to burn us out," Gideon said, his voice low and steady. "We can't just wait here." Nora's mind raced. They were outgunned and outnumbered. But they had one advantage. They knew the land around the cabin, and they knew what desperation felt like. "The fence," she whispered. "The one we fixed. The wire is pulled tight just above the snow line." Gideon looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. "It won't stop them all," he said. "It doesn't have to," she replied. "It just has to slow them down." Under the cover of darkness, Gideon slipped out the back door, a coil of spare wire in his hand. Nora stayed at the front window, firing a single shot from the revolver into the trees to draw their attention. It worked. 2 of Mercer's men fired back, the bullets thudding into the logs around the window. While they were distracted, Gideon was moving like a ghost through the shadows, stretching more wire between the trees, creating a web of invisible tripwires in the dark. He slipped back inside just as another volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin. "It's done," he breathed. They waited. The silence stretched, taut and terrifying. Then came a shout, followed by a curse and the heavy thud of a body hitting the frozen ground. Another shout, and another man went down, his leg tangled in the wire. Chaos erupted in the darkness. Mercer was screaming at his men, his voice raw with fury. It was the opening they needed. Gideon kicked open the front door and fired twice into the night. One of the remaining men cried out and fell. Now it was just Mercer and Jed Carver. Jed, seeing their plan collapsing, decided to save himself. He fired wildly in the direction of the cabin and then broke for the trees, disappearing into the darkness. But Royce Mercer wasn't running. He was consumed by a blind rage. He charged toward the cabin, a pistol in his hand, his face contorted with hate. He was no longer the polished gentleman from the train station. He was a cornered animal. Gideon met him on the porch. The two men crashed together, a tangle of limbs and fury. The pistol flew from Mercer's hand, landing in the snow. It was a brutal, ugly fight, fueled by years of stolen justice. Nora ran out onto the porch, her own revolver aimed at Mercer. But she didn't need it. Gideon was stronger, his rage colder and more focused. He landed a solid punch that sent Mercer sprawling onto his back. Gideon stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists. He could have ended it right there. He could have taken the life of the man who had destroyed his own. But he didn't. "The law can have what's left of you," he spat. As if on cue, they heard the sound of approaching horses. It was the town sheriff and a small posse, drawn by the sound of the gunshots. The sheriff, a man who had always been a little too friendly with Royce Mercer, took one look at the scene. At Mercer on the ground, at Gideon standing over him, and at the leather-bound ledger that Nora was holding in her hands. His face went pale. The evidence was undeniable. The whispered rumors, the unexplained accidents, the quiet fear that had held the town in its grip for years. It was all there, in black and white. Royce Mercer was arrested, his empire of lies and death crumbling around him. As the sun began to rise, casting a pink glow on the snow, the townspeople began to emerge from their homes. They saw Mercer being led away in cuffs. They saw Nora and Gideon standing together on the porch of the small cabin, bruised and exhausted, but unbroken. The whispers that had followed Nora were replaced by nods of respect. She hadn't just survived, she had liberated them. A month later, the snow was beginning to melt from the hills. The small chapel at the edge of town was filled with the morning light and a handful of quiet people. Nora wore her simple blue dress. Gideon wore a borrowed coat. They stood before the old preacher, their hands joined. When the preacher asked Gideon if he would take this woman, he simply said, "I already have." And when he asked Nora if she would take this man, a real smile, full of history and hardship, lit up her face. "I reckon he took me in before he knew what he was getting into." The preacher chuckled and pronounced them husband and wife. There was no applause, just the quiet, heartfelt approval of the few witnesses who understood what this union represented. It wasn't just two lonely people finding comfort. It was a partnership forged in fire, a testament to the fact that it's never too late to fight for what's right. Nora had come west seeking honesty, and she'd found it in the heart of a good man. But she had also found something else within herself, a strength she never knew she possessed. She hadn't come to be chosen. She had come to choose. She chose to stand, to fight, and to build something new from the ashes of the past. As they stepped out of the chapel, the bell overhead began to ring, not for tradition, but because someone wanted it to. A clear, joyful sound that echoed across the valley, a sound of justice finally served. If you believe that courage has no age and that it's never too late to find where you belong, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because stories like Nora's are a powerful reminder that the most unexpected journeys often lead us exactly where we were always meant to be.